All right, so welcome, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Joyce C. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Chicago. I'm really quite honored to be welcoming Professor Samuel Kassow, the Charles H. Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. Professor Kassow, as many of you know, maybe certainly know, is a historian of Polish East European Jewry in its life and in its destruction, Shoah. Without doubt, a preeminent historian how East European Jewry faced its destruction in this generation. His achievement of this score is so tremendous that it's easy to forget that before he turned his attention to this topic, he wrote essential works on late imperial Russian history, with a focus on state-society relations and on civil society, including an essential book on the precarious and partial freedoms of university life under Tsarist authoritarianism. He also authored essential works in both English and Yiddish on the interplay of conceptions of democratization, progress, and nationhood in East European Jewish culture in the 1910s and 20s. Following those engagements, Professor Kassow then turned his attention to the history of Polish Jewish life, thought, struggle during the Holocaust, something to which his own family history is closely connected, as he was himself spent his first years in the PP camp in Stuttgart, Germany. Of his many landmark achievements on this score, many of us here at Zoom, of course, know his indelible study, Who Will Write Our History, Manuel Ringelblum, the Warsaw Ghetto, the Onyx Shabbos Archive, the University Press 2007, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and translated to 8 languages. Honors. Following that landmark work, Professor Kassow has played and continues to play a central role in a number of vital public-facing projects on modern Jewish history. He was on a team of scholars that planned the Polin Museum, the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, and along with Professor David Roski's, Professor Kassow edited Volume 9 of the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization, the volume titled Catastrophe and Rebirth, 1939 to 1973 from Yale in 2020. Professor Kassow has not ceased to work on the history of the Holocaust and Jewish culture amidst the Holocaust. He's among a select group of historians chosen by Yad Vashem to write a 1-volume history of the Holocaust in Poland with the Holocaust. Which is forthcoming. In the meantime, he's completed another valuable project, helping restore to us, to our present, another Polish Jewish figure of great moment, alongside Ringelblum, the Yiddish cultural activist, turned relief worker, turned indefatigable memoirist, and phenomenologist of Polish Jewry's life and death, Rokhl Auerbach, who helped shape Israel's Yad Vashem Institute and pioneered key dimensions of Holocaust inquiry, particularly in the realm of oral history, but was also, as you'll hear, a key thinker and historian in her own right of the Polish Jewish experience of the Holocaust. And we're gathered here in the context of Professor Kassow's newly published translation of Rokhl Auerbach's Warsaw Testament, this came out last year, which has won the National Jewish Book Award for Holocaust Memoir. Please join me in welcoming Professor Samuel.
Well, I want to thank Professor Moss and the Jewish Studies program for inviting me here to talk about a remarkable and until recently a largely forgotten woman, Rachel Auerbach, who dedicated her whole life to preserving the memory of the Holocaust. Her life also reflected the tensions and the ruptures of East European Jewry in the 20th century. Childhood in a remote rural village in the foothills of the Carpathians, now in Ukraine. A youth spent in the rich, multi-ethnic urban tapestry of interwar Lviv, the fractious and intense Yiddish literary milieu of Warsaw in the 1930s, then the Ringelblum Archive in the Warsaw Ghetto. With Ringelblum's help, Auerbach left the Warsaw Ghetto just in the nick of time in March 1943, just before the start of the Ghetto uprising. And with a fake ID and a new Polish name, she was now Aniela Dobrowska, she became an intrepid courier for the Jewish underground. Day in, day out, she risked her life to deliver messages and money to Jews in hiding. And every evening she wrote. In Poland after the war, Auerbach joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission, and she did pioneering historical research. And after she left Poland for Israel in 1950, she started the Survivor Testimony Division at Yad Vashem. She played an important behind-the-scenes role during the preparations for the Eichmann trial, when she urged Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center. The Nuremberg trial, she said, and all the other trials were not really about Jews. And this Eichmann trial should be about the Jews. Instead of a narrow legal focus on Eichmann's particular activities in the Nazi bureaucracy, as Hannah Arendt would have preferred, Auerbach really wanted a show trial with victim testimony front and center, a trial that would show Israelis and everyone else who cared to listen just what it really meant to be a Jew under Nazi occupation. Now, in the last years of her life, she reworked her wartime writings into memoirs of the Warsaw Ghetto, and she managed to finish one volume, Feivel, Warsaw Testament, which was published in 1974, and she died in 1976 as she was writing the second, I'm Letzten Weg, on the last road. So I took those two volumes, I kind of blended parts of the second into the first, and I translated that, and this has appeared as Warsaw Testament. Among Auerbach's wartime writings was a remarkable essay entitled Yisker, Remember. She wrote it in November 1943. The ghetto was now just a heap of rubble. It's hundreds of thousands of Jews murdered. And on a dreary day in that November, she was riding on a streetcar in Polish Aryan Warsaw. By now, the Germans had ramped up their reign of terror against the Poles, and hardly a week went by without another mass shooting of Polish hostages in downtown Warsaw. And suddenly, in that streetcar, a Polish woman sitting next to Auerbach began to weep because the Germans had just shot her son. My son, she cried over and over. And Auerbach thought to herself, I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street. And I need to groan, I need to weep. Not 4 times a year. I feel the need to say Yisker, the prayer for the dead, 4 times a day. Poles could at least show their grief. Jews in hiding were not allowed to. So that night she went back to her room on Smolna Street. Her landlady had no idea she was harboring a Jew. And she began to write that essay. How do you say Yisker? How do you find the words? How do you find the template to talk about the murder of 500,000 Jews? And as she groped for images in Yisker to explain the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, she used the example of a flood in the mountains where she grew up. And I quote, I saw a flood once in the mountains, wooden huts torn from their foundations were carried above the raging waters. One could see lighted lamps in them, men, women, and children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside. One could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof, like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately toward heaven, waving toward the riverbanks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping, but one could not hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything. And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as hopelessly into the deluge of destruction. So why does she begin with the image of a natural disaster of a flood? I think that as she wrote, she could guess what people who hadn't been there, she guessed the kind of questions they'd be asking after the war. What had happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why had they let themselves be fooled? Those tough, resourceful Jews, why didn't they resist? By using the imagery of a flood, of a natural disaster, as my friend David Roskies once pointed out, she anticipated those questions. Can you criticize the reactions of people swept away in a tsunami? No. Now, the Holocaust was not a meta-historical event. It had to be studied in detail, but its enormity was too horrible and too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of those Jewish masses that she cherished so deeply. And in that same essay, she added this: and if for even one of the days of my life, I should forget how I saw you then, my people, desperate and confused, delivered over to extinction, may all knowledge of me be forgotten, may my name be cursed like that of the traitors who were unworthy to share your pain. And Auerbach never broke that vow, and for the rest of her life, she made sure she lived only that people remember. Nobody told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, and the wider public to listen, really listen to the testimony of survivors and to remember not just the famous names, but also the ordinary people who went to their deaths. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who reminded Jews to remember the writers and the poets, along with the fighters, to remember the ordinary Jews, to respect other kinds of resistance, not just armed resistance, to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but also the deep wound of cultural genocide. The Germans committed a double murder: the physical destruction of the Jews, and at the same time, the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. What Annette Viavorka called the era of the witness came about in no small measure thanks to the unstinting efforts of people like Rachel Auerbach, efforts to highlight the importance of survivor testimony, the Ekman trial being a key example. At a time when scholars like Rokhl Gilbert argued that documents were better sources than survivor accounts, Auerbach countered, yes, documents were well and good, but usually it's a source that the perpetrators produce rather than the victims. And anticipating the work of Saul Friedlander and Jan Thomas Gross, Auerbach argued that scholars had to hear out those witnesses, and as she crafted guidelines for conducting interviews in Yad Vashem, she pointed out that nuances of body language, and affect were often as significant as actual content. And so what if survivors got some dates and names wrong? Their authority as witnesses far outweighed any mistakes they made. Now, as only one of the 3 survivors of the Oynik Shabbos archive, of the 60 people that Emanuel Ringelblum brought into this secret archive in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Oynik Shabbos, only 3 survived. Rachel Auerbach had the rare opportunity not just to retrieve almost all of her wartime writings, but to rewrite them after the war. And there were some striking differences, which kind of reflect some rethinking that she did as she looked back on what she went through. When the Germans began the mass murder of Warsaw Jewry on July 22nd, 1942, Ringelblum called an emergency meeting of the archive, and he ordered everybody to hand in what they were writing, finished or not. There was no time to lose. With the help of the Jewish police, the Germans were deporting 7,000 Jews a day. You didn't know if you'd be alive tomorrow. All those documents were hastily handed over to the archive, and they were buried on August 3rd, 1942. And those documents surfaced in the first cache of the archive that was discovered in September 1946. Now, when Auerbach handed over her ghetto writings, this was on July 26, she attached a note full of violent anger, fear, and despair. And I quote, "I'm handing over this unfinished essay to the archive, the 5th day of the deportation. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such shame never. Jews, Jewish police as tools of the killers. I want to stay alive. I'm ready to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge, remember. By the way, let me make a quick digression. A major difference between real-time wartime writing during the Holocaust and post-war survivor memoirs is that in real-time wartime writing, a lot of anger against other Jews, which kind of disappears, and calls for revenge, which also kind of get moderated. Now, in that same note, she also wondered whether her writings would share the same fate as the scribblings of a coal miner trapped in a mine explosion with no survivors. His body will never be found. And if by some chance her writings ever surface someday, would anyone care to read them? Fast forward 2 years, it's now early 1944. She's on the Aryan side of Warsaw. Now she no longer had any doubt. She had to write. That was a debt she owed to the dead, but she also had to be careful. I quote, the mass murder, the murder of millions of Jews by the Germans, is a fact that speaks for itself. It is very dangerous to add to this subject interpretations or analyses, and anything that is said can quickly morph into hopeless hysteria or endless sobs. So one must approach this subject with the greatest caution, only in a restrained and factual manner. That had been my intention, not to express, but to transmit, to note only facts, but not to interpret. But she quickly added, I tried to do it, but I couldn't. I had a right to do it. After the war, in Poland and in Israel, after she had recovered her wartime manuscripts, her writing would take on yet another purpose, to ensure that the Jewish people remember, not just to keep faith with the dead, but also to use the lessons of the Holocaust to strengthen the nation and to tighten the bonds between Israel and the diaspora. Auerbach, as I said, left Poland for Israel in 1950, and while she had many difficulties in her new home, she never wavered in her conviction that after the Holocaust, Israel had become the vital center of the Jewish people. And let me add, those who erroneously see some contradiction between love of Yiddish and Zionism should consider the examples of Rachel Auerbach, Avram Sutzkever, Ray Rothman, and many other writers that I can mention. Like all good reportage, Auerbach's post-war books conveyed what she saw and observed in evocative, powerful language that made her writing an indispensable source for the cultural and social history of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the first step was to describe just what the Jewish people lost when the Germans destroyed Jewish Warsaw. Just after the war, Auerbach's friend Leo Finkelstein wrote in the Samolige Yiddische Warsaw in the past, and I quote, that Warsaw's strength derived not from Spusovus, but from Spusovsman, not from its historical traditions like Vilna or Krakow, but it derived its strength from its sheer mass and power. Warsaw, unlike these other Jewish centers, had no encrusted traditions, and thus Warsaw could be the pathbreaker in the modernization of Jewish life. When Finkelstein wrote about Warsaw in that book, he kept on emphasizing the crowds, the critical mass, the masses of Jews who came to Peretz's funeral in 1915, the tens of thousands who come to the Bund May Day demonstrations, the tens of thousands of Hasidim who greet the Gera Rebbe at the Warsaw Railroad Station. Mel Fravich, a Yiddish poet who'd been one of Auerbach's key mentors, recalled that Warsaw was like a sprawling mosaic, a mosaic of different Jewish tribes and subcultures, Hasidim, Polish-speaking professionals, Litvaks, and you can go on and on. And what Auerbach did is that it took the shattered bits and shards, and she reconstructed a mosaic of memory based on a poignant evocation of dozens of individual vignettes. and thus she spoke for those who had no one to remember them. The ordinary Jew she came to know in the ghetto as she ran the soup kitchen at Leshno 40, and the Jewish writers, actors, artists whose milieu she shared in the 1930s. The more one knew about what and whom the Germans had murdered, the more one could grasp the enormity of the national chum, of the national catastrophe. Much of Warsaw Testament includes Auerbach's wartime and post-war descriptions of the Warsaw Jewish intelligentsia, not just in the ghetto, but who they were before the war. Writers like Colin Lees, whose day job was working with children with special needs. Actresses like Miriam Orleska, who played Leah in the landmark Vilna Trupa production of the Dibuk. Sculptors like Avram Osksheva, who had designed Peretz's tomb. Roman Kramsky, the painter. Composers and choir directors, such as David Eisenstadt. Singers, such as Eisenstadt's 17-year-old daughter, Marisha, who had an amazing voice and who the Jews called the nightingale of the ghetto, and who was gunned down in cold blood because the Germans wouldn't let her board the same cattle car with her parents to take the final ride to Treblinka. Auerbach describes Shia Broidet, who translated Plato's dialogues into Yiddish. She wrote about Yankov Gerstein, who composed a cantata based on the poetry of Mani Leib. The religious poet Yisrael Stern, who wrote his best poetry, Auerbach believed, just weeks before his death in Treblinka. Rosa Simchovich, a saintly pedagogue who dedicated her life to helping poor kids in the Warsaw Jewish schools. Leib Shur, a bibliophile who collected abandoned Yiddish books in the ghetto and who hanged himself in his library surrounded by his books. Basha Berman, who started a children's library where kids could come in, borrow books, go under a warm blanket and listen to stories read by teachers about faraway places, stories that promised a better world after the war. Auerbach wrote about her cousin, an 11-year-old young girl named Yosima. Yosima was a musical prodigy who played Mozart's 25th piano concerto in the ghetto, after which the musicians in the orchestra lifted her up and the audience applauded and applauded. And then the chief violinist gave her a chocolate bar. If only this play had survived, that cantata, that poem, what she heard in the ghetto represented, in her words, a flowering of Jewish genius, a bright flame, as she put it, just before the final destruction. And as Auerbach traced the broad reach of Yiddish culture, which embraced music and the arts as well as literature, she underscored the depth of what the German murder machine had done. Now, before the war, Auerbach, like many Yiddish writers, had doubted Warsaw's future as a Yiddish cultural center, when more and more Jews were speaking Polish, when more and more Jewish kids were going to Polish schools. But after the war, she changed her mind. She explained that she had doubted the prospects for Yiddish culture in Poland because she had underestimated the vitality of the Polish Jewish masses. But in the ghetto, working in the soup kitchens, as she came into close contact with ordinary Jews, but especially with the masses of religious Jews dumped into the ghetto as refugees from the provincial cities, these were Jews she never would have really gotten to know had she lived her pre-war life. But once she got to know those people, she understood, in her words, that Jewish life in the Polish provinces was so deeply rooted that the Jewish nation, and I'm quoting her now, could have counted on the cultural capital of Polish Jewry of these Polish religious Jews, especially for generations to come. And whether everybody agrees with me or not is a question we can discuss later. Now, as soon as the war ended, Auerbach resolved to carry on Ringelblum's legacy and to find the tin boxes and milk cans that had been buried under the trackless rubble of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. The Yiddish writer Mendel Mann recalled Auerbach's talk at a third anniversary commemoration of the Ghetto Uprising in Warsaw in 1946. The usual tiresome speeches, the usual political posturing. And then Auerbach, the only woman on the podium, gets to the microphone. And I quote Mendel Mann. She did not make any speeches. She did not explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored with a stubbornness that deeply affected me. She demanded, she called, remember, there is a national treasure under the ruins. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I'm not making this up. I know what I'm talking about. This isn't just talk. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest and I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringelblum archive. It was important to her also because she believed that the Jewish survivors had to take a lesson from the Ringelblum archive. The traditions of the Ringelblum archive, she believed, could counteract disturbing trends that she'd already noticed in early post-war memoirs. Assimilated Jews who survived, like the pianist Władysław Szpilman, movie The Pianist. The biologist Ludwig Herschel, a convert, had written memoirs which kind of portrayed the Jews in the ghetto as an uncivilized mass. There were other survivors who were trying to score cheap political points. The Bund did everything. The communists did everything. Auerbach held up the model of the Oynik Shabbos, where she felt a shared sense of national mission trumped political differences. She was about 90% right. Ringelblum brought together religious and secular Jews, Bundists, Zionists, communists, the famous, the not so famous, men, women, in a common mission to collect and bury documents. Ringelblum's teacher, the historian Isaac Schipper, told a fellow inmate shortly before he was murdered in Majdanek, quote unquote, what we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. The Germans thought they would win the war. They would determine how the Jews would be remembered, if at all. But in an amazing act of spiritual resistance, Ringelblum said, no, posterity will remember us on the basis of Jewish and not German documents. Those time capsules will surface someday, even if we don't live to see it ourselves. And the murdered Polish Jews will be remembered not as a faceless mass of victims, but as individuals with names and identities, individuals who were part of a resilient Jewish community with hopes, with dreams, and with agency. And Ringelblum also called on fellow members of the archive not to pull punches, to be objective, to write about the collaborators as well as the heroes. I just want to digress now to show you a few pictures. This was what Warsaw looked like in 1945. This is the rubble after the bombing in 1939, after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in 1943, after the Polish Uprising of 1944. This was Warsaw. And it was hard to know that where to look for the archive. The archive had been buried under the school at Novolimki 68, but nobody could even find where Novolimki Street had been, much less where house had been. But using pre-war aerial photographs and using the spire of that church, engineers and surveyors guessed, and one survivor of the archive, Hirschwasser, knew where it had been buried. And they started digging and they found the archive. Now, Wasser's back is to us. He survived by a very thin margin, once jumping from a train, taking him to Treblinka. This guy's Michal Borovich, who became a historian. He also survived by a thin margin. He was in the Janovska labor camp and hanged. He was actually hanged, but the rope broke. And the SS man was a gentleman and believed in hanging people twice, so he was released back in the camp and then he escaped. This is Vassar examining some of the cans. This is the second cache of the archive, the milk cans found in December 1950. And this contained Auerbach's very important interview of Artem Shapitsky, the escapee from Treblinka. This is Emanuel Ringelblum as a young man. And this is a wonderful picture. This is a meeting of the Evo in 1935. And this is Ringelblum, this from the left, Ringelblum, Itzhak Manger, Rachel Auerbach, Jacob Schotsky. Second from the right is Rokhl Mahler. No, so that's the cool pictures. Now, like much of the Oynik Shabbos staff, Auerbach was active in the pre-war Evo. And in the Evo, you all know what the Evo is, right? The Yiddish Scientific Institute. Scholars and ordinary Jews work together to collect documents, source materials, build archives, raise the prestige of Yiddish, and use self-knowledge to empower Jews and help them in their struggle for dignity and equality. A key goal of the Evo was to explore everyday Jewish life. As Max Weinreich, the director, said, so der kennen dem Heim, to know the everyday, the surveys, interviews, autobiographies. And this was the modus operandi of the Oynik Shabbos, which in many ways was basically the Evo in the Warsaw Ghetto. And Auerbach's work followed in the footsteps, not only of Emanuel Ringelblum, but also of Evo director Max Weinreich, who made special efforts to incorporate the insights of Sigmund Freud and social psychology into the study of Polish Jewry. In the highly politicized and divided world of interwar Polish Jewry, where so much emphasis was placed on the collective, on the party, on the movement, Max Weinreich said we also have to study the individual. You can't understand Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, unless you understand Reb Yisrael, the Jewish person, the aspirations, the drives, the obsessions, hopes of the many individuals who made up the Jewish mass in Poland. So unlike so many other writers and memoirists of the Holocaust, Auerbach focused not so much on recording facts and events, as on evoking a social psychological study of Warsaw Jewry on the brink of the abyss. Before the war, she studied social psychology at the Jan Kazimierz University in Lvov, and had come to know over time many of the Polish experts in the field. In her wartime and post-war writings, she delved into the complex interplay of psychological factors in individuals, families, entire social groups. How does a community, how do individuals react to a slowly unfolding catastrophe, a disaster that began in 1939 and progressed in stages? Economic ruin, armbands, beating, a ghetto, disease, hunger, and then mass deportation, which the Germans skillfully camouflaged at first as a mere culling of unproductive elements. How do people experience time? How do they try to shield themselves from the awful truth, rumors, false hopes, illusions? She told a complicated story, resilience, vitality, self-sacrifice on the one hand, corruption and moral collapse on the other. She also had brilliant insights about how rumors, jokes, and street songs could be seen as a self-defense reflex, a poignant and powerful sign of individual resistance. She stressed the German skillful use of psychological tricks to effect the destruction of Warsaw Jewry. The Germans knew how to use the Jews' strengths against them. They played with the Jews and with their natural human instincts of self-preservation and hope. In her brilliant observations of the mass hysteria that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, seichel, natural optimism, now accelerated their journey into the abyss. Natural optimism, we Jews have suffered before. We'll get through this. We will outlive them. Seichel, common sense. Look, let's buy time. We'll give them bribes. We'll give them gifts. We'll set up shops to make boots. Why would the Germans want to kill us if we're so useful? And she delved into the riddle of how Jews let themselves be fooled. And I quote, and still other Jews, broad-shouldered, deep-voiced, with powerful hands and hearts, artisans, workers, wagon drivers, porters, Jews who with a blow of their fist could floor any hooligan who dared enter their neighborhoods. Where were you when your wives and children, when your old fathers and mothers were taken away? What happened to make you run off like cattle stampeded by fire? Was there no one to give you some purpose in the confusion? Would other peoples confronted with a similar massive assault have acted better? No. Did Warsaw Jewry eventually recover and fight back? Yes. Should one blame the Jewish masses for not having fought back earlier? Only those who had not been there, she implied, would do so. Was armed resistance the only way Jews stood up to the Germans? Absolutely not. As I said before, Auerbach grew up in a very rural area where she spent a lot of time with Poles and Ukrainians, and where she also acquired a love of Jewish folklore and the Yiddish language. And she believed that that immersion in her non-Jewish surroundings helped her survive later on. And I quote, "How did I survive on the Aryan side when hundreds of other Jews perished? It certainly wasn't because I was smarter. What helped me were my early years growing up in the village. Those close ties with non-Jews left a mark on my personality. What rubbed off on me was that rural Slavic temperament." Like many other Galician Jews, Auerbach combined a deep Jewish identity with a first-class Polish education. At Lvov University, she befriended the young poetess Feivel and the budding writer and painter, talking about Bruno Schulz. In 1929, she helped begin Zuschauer, a literary journal that tried to bring the Polish-speaking Galician Jewish intelligentsia closer to Yiddish. And she had many interests, but I think her first love was always Yiddish culture. And her vision of that culture was always inclusive rather than exclusive, one that united Jews rather than divided Jews, that put culture ahead of political differences. Zuschauer as a project failed, and it closed in 1932. And of course, on the journal, when she was on the journal, she had to endure a lot of condescension and a lot of misogyny, aimed both at her and at Feivel. This might have been the first such incident in her life, but it wasn't the last. In the late 1930s in Warsaw, as she was in a relationship, a very dysfunctional relationship with the poet Itzhak Manger, she had the nickname the Literarische Beilage, the literary supplement, i.e. she was not an important writer in her own right, she was simply Manger's girlfriend. And later on, she would wonder if her path at Yad Vashem would not have been easier had she not been a woman. But that only encouraged Auerbach to redouble her efforts to highlight the critical contributions of women to Yiddish literature. Much of the power of Auerbach's reportage stemmed from her ability to navigate cultural boundaries. It was derived from a life that straddled different worlds: village, shtetl, city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles and Jews, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Jewish literary elite in the world of the Jewish masses, religious and secular, diaspora nationalists and Zionists. When the war began in September 1939, Auerbach was about to run away from Warsaw and go to Lvov, where she came from and which was under the Soviet occupation. But Emanuel Ringelblum summoned her at the last minute and said, no, you can't run. Not everybody has a right to run. You have to stay here and help me, and you have to start a soup kitchen. And then he asked her to join the Onyxanis Archive. I'm kind of hurrying things up here a little bit, so I'm skipping over. Her soup kitchen on Leshno 40, which fed 2,000 Jews a day, offered her a unique vantage point to get to know and observe a large number of eaters that came to the kitchen every day. And the story provided a gripping behind-the-scenes look at the desperate battle that the ghetto was fighting against hunger. She investigated the social history of hunger by telling the story of the soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. The dead who ended up in the pits of the Gensha cemetery were not an undifferentiated mass. They were individuals whose idiosyncrasies Auerbach recorded. The young mother expelled from her shtetl, who arrived at the soup kitchen with 4 children in tow and a little tot suckling at her breast, and the mother proudly pointing to the little infant, saying, what a guy, what a guy, Odem Amesh, Odem Amesh. A family of solid, rugged Jewish boys from a country farm who'd been expelled into the ghetto every day, coming to get a pot of soup for their father, and never failing to ask, and never failing to add insulin of spicy yo. May he live to 120. Hundreds of stolid members of the Jewish middle class, now reduced to desperate poverty. And as the director of the soup kitchen, Auerbach confronted serious psychological pressures and moral challenges. She thought she was doing a good thing, but many of these starving Jews saw her as a heartless bureaucrat. Why can't you give me an extra bowl of soup? Do you know who I was before the war? I was a doctor. You're a heartless so-and-so. And what made things worse for Auerbach is that she came to believe that the kitchen itself was saving nobody. The soups that they handed out provided about 600-700 calories a day. That was better than the official ration of 184 calories. But if you only lived on those soups, you would starve over 3 or 4 months. And not only that, but you could see all the stages of that starvation. What do? Do we choose a few people and feed them up, or do we give everybody equal portions and watch them die? And she asked this question, so did Ringelblum. And here's an excerpt from her memoirs. I remember the Koberner family. 3 sisters who managed to rescue a fine aluminum pot from what once had been a home and a life. In the early days, one of the sisters would come to get soup for all 3. Maybe the others were working somewhere. I didn't really know the family at first. After half a year, a woman approached me. She had a chit and was carrying a pot. My sister was sick, she told me. That happened before they organized the ghetto. Our kitchen in those days was serving about 600 soups a day. The woman who doled out the soup, Miss Selena, she knew all the customers. She served them with a smile and a warm word. She knew about their lives and their troubles. She asked about the new sister, how the older one was doing. And so it was. One sister after another came. A little while, Helena informed me that the 3rd sister was now standing in the soup line. So the second sister, like the first sister, no longer had the strength to come. Only the pot remained as before, well cleaned and glistening brightly. That pot told volumes about a way of life, about a tidy home, about the dignified decline of yet one more Jewish family. August 4th, 1941, she writes, "What is the use of all our work if we can't save even one person from death and hunger?" Ringelblum gave her new assignments. In September 1942, she interviewed Avram Shapitsky, who escaped from Treblinka, and that interview took over 100 pages in Yiddish, and it was sent to the Polish government in exile. After the war, Auerbach developed a special bond with the Treblinka survivors. And as I said, when she escaped to the Aryan side before the ghetto uprising, she continued the archives. And she wrote hundreds and hundreds of additional pages, many of which can now be found in Yad Vashem and in the Berman archives in Israel. The last thing I want to say is her striking attitude towards Poland and the Poles. Many Jewish survivors had nothing but bad things to say about Poland and about the Poles. Auerbach is a great exception, part because the Poles she knew came from the progressive liberal intelligentsia that risked their lives to help Jews. And Auerbach paints a nuanced picture of Polish behavior that many other survivors don't portray. Now, I could give another whole lecture about what happened to Auerbach when she got to Israel and her problems at Yad Vashem, but I'll save that for my next slide. So at this point, I'll be glad to take questions.
Yeah, I actually want to say, first of all, thank you, Sam. And I might go over that computer and get it back. But I also want to take this opportunity to say, as I should have said before, that this lecture is thanks to the generosity of the Gossett family and the Harold and Jean Gossett Fund. Suzanne is with us, she's her granddaughter, and we remember in this context, Philip, who I understand have been much involved in giving this. So it's thanks to the Gossett family, this is possible. I will open the floor to questions in our audience here, and there's also quite a few folks on the Zoom, so Mike, okay. So Sam, I think I'll keep an eye on the computer and I'll turn over to you the
Recording in progress.
Yeah, what you said about that. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, what you said about the importance of the rural backdrop and experience or life and perspective made me also think about Rokhl's early writing, especially.
They were very close friends.
Yeah, and the importance specifically of the landscape and the shared sensory experience of nature and all the plants and animals, which connected for me to your description of the flood that Auerbach remembers and uses in this way. So I was wondering if you could speak maybe a little bit more to whether the sensitivity towards landscape, towards the contours of the environment, whether built or natural, comes through for you in other places in Auerbach writing. Yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, this is very true in her in the pre-war writing. I would add to the issue of landscape the interplay of landscape and folk custom. She was very much interested in the folklore of these Jews in Podolia. in Warsaw Testament, she paid a lot of attention to, she had a whole chapter about the folklorist, Rokhl, who died in 1941. And she talked about the customs of these Jews in rural Golia. And she reproduced many of, I'm not a linguist, but I think the word is macaronic songs, where there would be a song about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or a song about Moses, but half would be in Ukrainian and half would be in Yiddish. And then there'd be songs about the rivers and songs about the mountains. So yeah, she was very, very conscious of that particular issue.
That question and your answer made me wonder. She writes so much, or as you described it, she writes so much about things that this kind of flowering genius that was cut away and all these kinds of things that could have been and then weren't, and the enormous tragedy and loss of that. And I wonder to what extent she saw herself in that, which is to say, was her own life, though she survived, was the trajectory of her work so different from what it began, that she saw her own potential as a poet, as someone who wrote about nature, as a folklorist or whatever, as something that a trajectory that had been cut off.
That's a good question. She was not the kind of person to say, look at me, I was so talented, I could have been stupendous. She never said it. She was certainly upset by her lack of success before the war. That is, she supported herself on the gig economy. She could never land a full-time job with a newspaper. She wrote articles. She did translations. She supported herself by writing, but the hope she had of being taken on by one of the Yiddish dailies like Kinder Men, that eluded her. The best she could do would be to replace writers going on vacation. And she continued to write. Over time, I think she wrote less poetry and fewer short stories and more book reviews and more journalism. Her real forte was reportage, and her real forte was psychological writing. One of the best things she ever wrote was her review of She Perilous Eden from the Kassow, or Ordinary Jews, which is kind of like the Yiddish call it sleep. Centering not on politics, not on what will happen to the Jewish people, but centering on a Jewish family in the provinces and on the sexual awakening of an adolescent boy and his musings about his Polish maid. Of course, a Bundist reviewer said, how could this be written about in our Yiddish literature? And when Perla, by the way, appeared at the second Yiddish conference in 1935, he was booed off the stage. Shulm, dirt, pornography. But Auerbach gave it a great review. She thought this was wonderful. How great that we finally got to the novel we could write about sex. You know, I mean, she was really happy about that. But anyway, after the war, she just had one purpose. That was to protect women slaves. I'm not exaggerating. That was it. Her personal life, as I said, had not been too happy. Her relationship with Monger, she really loved Monger, but he was abusive, associated, he was drunk. They had one very unfortunate meeting after the war in 1945, when he, in public, called her a whore and worse things. And they never really spoke again, although they were both in Israel, and she helped him get his work published, but they never had any more contract. But her whole life been centered on Yad Vashem and on writing articles in the Hebrew press. She didn't write Hebrew very well, the articles had to be translated. Her experience, her actual experience in the Eichmann trial is very moving because she was looking forward to testifying for an hour and a half. She was told she'd be given an hour and a half to testify about removal, about the soup kitchens, about the stuff, about the schools. And one of her hopes was that this would, remind Israelis that it wasn't just armed resistance. Well, they changed the schedule, and the two witnesses that appeared before her were Yitzhak Zuckerman and Sylvia Lubetkin, kind of the golden couple. Sylvia Lubetkin, a woman, a hero, a genuine hero, the ghetto uprising. Yitzhak Zuckerman, the deputy commander of the Jewish fighting organization. They electrified the courtroom, and then Auerbach came. And she insisted on testifying in Hebrew, which was a mistake. And the judge got bored, and the judge cut her off after half an hour. And she never got over that. And one other thing I want to say, any consideration of Auerbach's life has to touch on her terrible experience in Yad Vashem. She was fired by the director of Enzion, Tibur. And she was fired because she really clashed with Tibur and what Yad Vashem should be doing. Tibur was a real Zionist, and as a real Zionist, and also as an academically trained historian, Tibur did not see the Holocaust as such as a terrible surprise. Zionism predicted that the diaspora would end in a disaster. They didn't foresee the scope of the disaster, but the Holocaust itself was not as important in the Tibbur's view as in creating an encyclopedia of all Jewish communities, writing the history of Jewish communities, and getting PhDs to do this. And he looked at Auerbach and at other survivors like Nachman Blumenthal and so on. Looked at Auerbach, said, well, she's a little hysterical, she's emotional, she doesn't have a PhD, she's not an academic, and she wants to talk about starvation and suffering, and she wants to talk about the panic in the ghetto. That's not our priority. And they kept butting heads, they kept cutting her budget, and finally he fired her. But then the survivors rose up and there was a big campaign and she was rehired and Tibur left Yad Vashem. But Auerbach never had an easy time. And she suspects that in part it's because she was not part of the political movement. That she'd been close to the labor machine, then somebody would have protected her. Had she been close to that politician, someone would have protected her. Avram Sitzker got funded for the Golden Cape because he was friendly with somebody who helped run the Histadrut. But Auerbach didn't have any protectors, and she was an unmarried woman without kids. And she was also very, very driven. Now, David Roski's told me a story about her Holtzman's mother. Holtzman is a great Israeli literary scholar. And when Holtzman's mother was pregnant with the unborn Abner, she told Auerbach that she'd have to cut back her work for the testimony division. And Auerbach said, how dare you? What's more important?
Can I pose a question? Exactly. You said so much about Auerbach's life and its intertwining with this passion for testimony, for thinking about testimony. Can you say a little bit more about the particular thinking about the nature of testimony? She played a special role in developing techniques for oral history.
Yeah, she wanted tape recorders, and she wanted tape recorders and even better video recorders, but she didn't get that. she only got a small part of that. She believed that to really get testimony, to really deal with it in the right way, you need recording and you need to listen to the voice and the affect, you need to look at the face. But one of the reasons why she was so interested in testimony is because in a way she saw this as a continuation of the same national collective will that was seen in the Evo, in the Yiddish Shabbos, in the movement to write the memorial books after the war. It was an act of collective determination to leave the record. This was a national movement and it had to be encouraged. And she wanted to really highlight that at the end.
Thank you. Recently, this lecture series included a lecture by Sergio Luzzatto that's written on rebuilding. And I bring it up because you touched on the harsh feelings that Rokhl and Auerbach had towards Jewish collaborators, Jewish capos, Jewish police. And in your earlier book, you mentioned Shia Perle. I think you mentioned it now regarding his next book, but you also mentioned him as attacking those Jews who did things like that, including Chernikov for his quote cowardly suicide. What I'm really getting at is whether it is correct for a historian, whether a Jewish historian, as you or me or people in this room, do we have the right to judge a capo or a Jewish policeman? Or do we have a duty to record it without judging them?
You know, I tell my students, I'm retired now, it's the helps. First of all, when it comes to the Jewish police, there were monsters. There were also policemen who risked their lives. And each ghetto was different. In Kovno, the leaders of the Jewish police submitted to terrible torture rather than give up hiding places. There were many times with Jewish police fight all over. There were so I don't believe in these blanket judgments. Now, parallel, there's a famous incident in 1952, and this is what it's about. On August 26, 1942, Shia Perle, who would be murdered in Auschwitz a year later, saw a Jewish policeman schlepping a little 5-year-old boy to his SS handler, saying, "This is my 5th head of the day." Yes, they had to provide 5 Jews a day, 6 or 7 a day, and if they didn't, they were told they and their families would be the The SS man pulled out a pistol, shot the little kid. So the little kid was dying on the pavement, blood spraying on the pavement. The SS man lit a cigarette, calmly said, "This little dog doesn't count for a cigarette, go get him." And the Jewish policeman scampered off to get the dog children. The parent came back and wrote that day something he never would have written after the war that he survived. He said, "A people that can produce such sons of bitches as the Jewish police is a people that deserves everything it's getting." Now, after the war, it's the 6 million Kedoshim, the 6 million martyrs. Could you imagine a Jew in a DP camp in 1948 saying, "We deserved what we got because of the police or because of the collaborators"? Ringelblum, of course, read that because it was in the mill camp. You could say, "Well, this doesn't make us look good." He could have ripped it up, but he put it. But I asked myself, You know, I'd like to think that Jewish policeman was a monster, but if my life and my family's life was on the line, am I gonna say I would never have done that? I'd like to say that, but I'm not sure. Time goes, if Adam Chernyakov committed suicide rather than help deliver Jewish kids to the Nazis, it didn't make any difference. 6 weeks later, Chaim Minkowski in the Lodz ghetto tearfully told Jewish mothers, you have to hand over all of your kids under the age of 10. I tried, but I had no choice. You have to give me your children. And they took the children under 10 and they killed them. Now, Rukowski was a wheeler and dealer and he knew how to play the game. There were a million other factors, but the Lodz ghetto was not liquidated until August 1st, 1944. That is, on August 1st, 1944, there were 70,000 Jews left in the Lodz ghetto. When was the bomb assault on Hitler? July 20th, 1944. Had Hitler been killed by the bomb, then what would we have said about Rukowski? Rukowski told the Jews at that time, I know you hate me, but I'm buying time and I'm happy to be judged by a Jewish court after the war. Then how would we have judged Rukowski? Now, Yehuda Bauer would have said he was a war criminal and he should have been lynched, but others would have had different views. There were survivors in the Lodz ghetto that I knew who said we hated Rukowski, but I survived because of him, because he bought time. So I throw up my hands. I will not judge. As far as Chernyakov is concerned, he was a thoroughly decent person who was in an impossible job. And there were many people who judged him too harshly. I think Ringelblum was much too harsh. Marek Edelman was much too harsh. By the way, Marek Edelman also called Ringelblum a commie Soviet stooge. You know, so there you have it. I really hate the judgment game because here we are sitting in this beautiful university and we could say, well, that person gets an A and that person gets a B minus. And who knows?
So much, Sam, and other good for looking at the journey. I had so many questions, and every one of them was answered, you know, like 10 minutes later. But one thing that comes to mind is that you described Auerbach's relationship with Yiddish, or thinking about Yiddish as being very inclusive and not exclusive. But then you also mentioned that she discovered that she didn't previously, she only learned later after the war or during the war that she hadn't previously appreciated the centrality that Hasidic Jews and religious Jews represented as a kind of storehouse of cultural knowledge. And somehow there's a contradiction here. Or can you say more about what that inclusivity didn't like? Did she, before the war, did she expect in a kind of sort of intellectual parochialism that other religious Jews would eventually secularize and that ego would lead the way and that would be the storehouse of folklore, would be the storehouse of tradition?
No, that's a good question. I thought about that myself. And here's what I think she's getting at. And by the way, there's a chapter there in the second book on a religious guy named Kozlovsky, who she worked with in Lithuania, who was very religious and she got to know him and became friends. He was killed. But in that chapter, she says things that help explain what we're getting at. She thought she knew all the Polish Jews before the war. She thought that she was well plugged in. And in fact, when Wanda Meltzer wrote the scathing reportage about Shara, you know, these weird exotic Jews in North Warsaw, there's this Polish journalist who wrote a book called The Dark Continent. It wasn't about Africa, it was about the Jewish neighborhoods of North Warsaw. Their nikhas and their circumcisions, and they're very weird people, and they live not far away from us. And Auerbach really let her have it. Although I couldn't find the article that Auerbach wrote. So Auerbach thought she knew these people, but the fact was that with some exceptions, like Shimon Huberman, with some exceptions like Rogovi, the circles that Auerbach moved in, the Evo circles, the Yiddish, the journalistic circles, they didn't really know the world of the provincial religious Jews. They didn't really have a lot of contact with them. They thought they knew them, but they didn't. In the ghetto, they really had to talk to them. They got to know them. The leaders of the kosher soup kitchens participated in the daily meetings of the directors. And then Auerbach realized that this was a whole world that she had totally missed. It's kind of like, why is Shtisel so popular, right? You've all watched Shtisel, right? It's about ultra-Orthodox Jews. Now, I thought I kind of knew ultra-Orthodox Jews, but the thing about Shtisel is that they come alive as individuals. They come alive as people with their own particular characters. And in a way, I think this is what Auerbach discovered in the Warsaw Ghetto. And then she said, God, she said, these, we were worried about the Polonization of the Jews and the disappearance of Yiddish and the Schmendricks, all the Jews who spoke Polish. These people would have kept us going for generations. Now, again, whether she was right or wrong is not for me to say, but that's what she thought.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question of a different nature. I'm wondering about your experience of translating Auerbach and whether challenges came up that perhaps you didn't anticipate, and how you view your role as her translator in relation to your role as a historian this period.
Well, that's a great question because, see, I never did any translation before, and I thought it would be a piece of cake. I thought I'd pour myself a big glass of brandy and, just kind of, and it didn't work out. It was very difficult. It was very, very difficult. There were some times when I spent a whole afternoon on one sentence. And what made it even worse is that it was a double translation because Auerbach translated what she wrote in Polish into Yiddish. Most of her writing during the war was in Polish. Now, don't get me started on why she wrote in Polish if she was a Yiddishist. That's a question in and of itself. But much of what she wrote was in Polish. She translated that into Yiddish. Then I translated the Yiddish into English. And some of it was very, very difficult. I developed an enormous amount of respect for translators now. And I could never translate poetry. And now I'm in a reading group and we're reading the great Italian novel, The Betrothed by Manzoni. And there's a new translation, which is really good. I forget the translator's name now. He's really good. And I keep telling myself, my God, this guy is amazing. He's as important as the original writer, if not more.
I'm gonna square something. You've spoken about her devotion to Yiddish, and you just mentioned about translating from Polish to Yiddish, and her insistence that people utilize Yiddish and embrace it. You also mentioned that her Hebrew wasn't so good. That her Hebrew wasn't so good.
No.
Yet, possibly the biggest disappointment in her life was her presentation at Yad Vashem, which she insisted on performing in Hebrew. Why?
Well, because she believed in the centrality of Israel, and she believed that the resurrection of the Hebrew language was one of the greatest things that happened to the Jewish people, and she wanted to testify without a translator. She did okay. It's not that she was incoherent, but she was holding. It wasn't her first language. Now, the question, you're right, I mean, had she testified in Yiddish or Polish, her testimony would have been very fluent, perhaps more compelling, but she wanted to speak to them. And she wrote a book of there was a book that appeared in Yiddish called In Land Yisrael, her Yiddish language reportage about the immigrants who came to Israel in the early 50s. The Yemenites, the Iraqis, the Polish Jews, and the Bavarot in the 10 cities. And it was tough, but you could sense the pride. You could sense the real pride.
There's some concern that the Yiddish speakers were somehow less than.
The Yiddish speakers were, Yiddish was discriminated against in Israel in the early years. Yiddish was even, I would say Yiddish was harassed. For example, the Yiddish theaters didn't get a discount from the government. Usually there was a cultural discount. The Yiddish theaters didn't get that. The Yiddish newspapers were not given the paper allocation. Oh, somehow we don't have enough paper. Ben Gurion was very, very concerned that Yiddish, he didn't want Yiddish to take hold in Israel. And he didn't have, but Gurion really believed that the immigrants coming in, he once called them human dust. They're like the Jews in the desert who will disappear. It's their kids who will be the future of our country. But these people, you know, from Yemen and from Israel and from Poland, we can't build a country based on them. So Auerbach, of course, you know, was living a contradiction, and she didn't appreciate this at all. But at the same time, she respected the great project of building a church state.
One more question.
The whole kind of central contradiction between hope and despair that characterizes Soup Kitchen, that characterizes Zoe Chavez, and her own need to collect these testimonies. Do you have any other feeling about how she managed that? Did it involve thinking about two different times, like a recurring time of Jewish tragedy that has a longer trajectory, or maybe nothing to do with that? But I mean, it seems so central that everything you talked about is that is there cynicism? Did she fall into despair, or did she somehow have a way of expressing the hope that gives her the energy to do all of this?
She fell into despair in the ghetto. Her diary shows that, which by the way was written. And
Which you're allowed to talk.
What?
You're.
Your Bible carrying on that has translated that people into it's appeared in German translation, and now it's going to appear in French translation, but not in English. In the ghetto, she had many moments of despair. After the war, you know, sometimes and I may be totally wrong. I mean, there are other people working on it. Apparently, Shabani is doing all of those things. And I guess Rachel Berjanski is working on it. But in my mind, Auerbach is like a mother bear protecting her cubs. Her cubs are the Polish Jews, the memory of the Polish Jews, the victims, the survivors. And these survivors came to Israel in the early 50s, and many of these young soldiers called themselves. Like, why didn't you fight back? Like, why did you let them do what they did? Many of the survivors were treated with scorn. Of course, that attitude changed for the Eichmann trial in the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. But in the early 50s, Auerbach saw the scorn that many of the survivors had in Israel, and that was what she was about. And as she was doing this is just my opinion, she began to understand that she believed was this incredible vitality of the ordinary Jews. And just saying, man, let me say that, one of the undercurrents in the Onyx Shabbos archive, Ringelblum was sponsoring intellectual symposium of Jewish intellectuals, including Hillel Zeitlin and Rogovi and Perlet and Milakovsky, who was head of the medical department of UNRA. And the whole thing was basically the question that was raised in Affen Shadweg in 1939. That is, what has the Enlightenment given the Jewish people? The French Revolution, the Enlightenment, did we fall for a false bill of goods? 150 years after the French Revolution, we have Hitler starting World War II. 100 years after the Declaration of the Rights of Man, we have the Dreyfus Affair. The modern secular Jew, according to some of these intellectuals, was like someone who left the old shore of Jewish tradition and never reached the other shore of acceptance into European society. He was stranded between two shores. And if you compare the alleged heroism of the medieval Jews who died for Kiddush Hashem with the corruption and cowardice of the modern secular Jew who has lost his grounding in Yiddishkeit and whose secular culture has given him less in return, you see the corruption and the egotism that were surrounded with in the Warsaw Ghetto. So these were some of the things that Ringelblum was hearing, that the modern Jew is less than the older Jew, that Polish Jewry before the war was already kind of engaged and it was in a moral decline. But Ringelblum writes, he's thinking about this. Okay, are they right? Are they right? And then he finally writes, I think, in early 1943. And I think this is where it links up to what Auerbach is coming to feel herself. I thought about this and I say, would the Jews act worse than any other people who would have been in the same situation? The answer finally is no. Jews passed the test. They acted just as well, if not better, than anybody else. What people ignore, Ringelblum says, and he says this in the Yiddish, the stille Heldentum von dem jüdischen Massenmensch, the quiet heroism of the ordinary Jew. The Jews who simply worked in the house communities, helped their neighbors, tried to keep their heads up, tried to maintain their dignity. Jews who had no money, no contacts, no knowledge of Polish, no chance in hell of surviving. And another one of these symposia, Dr. Milakovsky, said the Warsaw Ghetto was like a huge boiling pot. The top layer is kind of boiling water, and that's what you see. That's the Jewish police, that's the speculators, those are the fancy restaurants, those are the Gestapo agents, those are Jews hustling and deceiving other Jews. But then beneath is the real story, which is the hundreds of thousands of Jews working in self-help, working to maintain their decency, helping their families. And this is the story that hopefully historians will remember in the end. And this is, I think, what Auerbach came away with. And she believed, like Ringelblum, that just as there was no contradiction between cultural resistance and armed resistance, so it's part of the same impulse, there was no contradiction between the struggle for self-help and to stay alive and the great struggle to leave testimony. That it was part of the same national impulse and that this was precious. She was amazed at the movement to produce the history, to produce the memorial books. And she believed that one of the great opportunities that the state of Israel had was to kind of correct the omissions of the Nuremberg trial. Because the Nuremberg trial, of course, could not put the Jews front and center. The Nuremberg trial was based on a particular legal sleight of hand to make it possible to try these Nazis for crimes that, many lawyers said they couldn't have been really tried for. And so what Auerbach said is, this should be a trial to serve Jewish interests. And to do that, we need victim testimony.